welcome to Educate, Agitate, Organise Saturday. Delighted this week to be joined by my co-host, Jane Aitchison. Jane, how are you doing?
I'm really well. It's brilliant to be here again. Thanks, Matt.
And Jane, what are we talking about this week?
Well, we're talking about the police bill that's currently on its way through Parliament and threatens to stop our fundamental right to protest. And so it's absolutely brilliant that we've managed to get Richard Burgon, Leeds East Labour MP, here to speak on that for us today.
Fantastic. Let's go to interview. It's been called an opportunistic crackdown on freedom of speech and civil liberties. Unite the Union have called it out of control authoritarianism. I am, of course, talking about the controversial Police, Crime and Sentencing Bill. Tonight, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by the Member of Parliament for Leeds East and Secretary of the Socialist Campaign Group of Labour MPs, Richard Burgon. Richard, thank you for joining us.
Great to see you, Matt. How are you doing? I'm
very well, Richard. Thanks for asking. So look, there's a lot to unpack here, and I'm really grateful you could make the time to join us, to share with us, your expertise, your knowledge, your insights into this emerging, really, really vital campaign against this hugely egregious bill. I want to make a start with, so it's a huge document, 307 pages, 176 clauses, and the bits that seem to be causing the most contention in the eyes of the public are the elements around, and obviously it's a big bill, but the elements around public order in particular have been particularly egregious. Now, these sections are not supported by a white paper or a green paper. There's been no draft bill. So, what's the Tories' justification for this?
Well, fundamentally, it's political, just as everything is when you get to the bottom of it. And what this is about, really, this bill, is part and parcel of the authoritarian drift that we've seen under Boris Johnson and the Conservatives. We've seen that in relation to the Spy Cops bill. We've seen that in relation to this police crackdown bill. We've seen it in relation to the overseas operation bill, and the other examples of other authoritarian worrying moves as well. What the Conservatives are doing, I think, they're actually trying to remove people's ability to resist. They're trying to remove people's ability to fight back. And the reason the Conservatives are doing this is because they know that in the economic crisis that we're in, the Conservatives are going to make the political choice to pursue policies against the interests of the majority and against the interests of discriminated against minorities as well. And they want to remove people's ability to fight back against this. So I think really that this bill is part and parcel of that. And if they try to remove our ability to resist, we can only respond with greater resistance.
So this government trying to stop us using our voices, trying to stop us from speaking out, is that what makes this bill particularly dangerous in your view?
I think it is. It's, in essence, making protests all but illegal. It's like we've seen with strike action, but on an even greater scale. The Conservatives in government haven't made going on strike illegal, but they've made it harder to go on strike lawfully. And it's the same with this, isn't it? You can protest just as long as it's not too loud, just as long as it doesn't inconvenience anybody, just as long as it's where the police say the protest can be and the rest of it. So you can protest as long as it doesn't really achieve what a protest is meant to do. So it's really worrying, really authoritarian. Look, for example, we've got ways of fighting back through strike action, fighting back at the ballot box, fighting back through protest. And all of those three areas have been or are being attacked by the government as part of this authoritarian drift. They're trying to bring in voter ID, which will actually suppress the votes in working class and black and minority ethnic communities, thus hampering people's ability to fight back through the ballot box. They're trying to make it much to protest effectively, therefore hampering people's ability to fight back through protest. And as I've said already, through their anti-trade union legislation, they've made it much more difficult for workers to go on strike. So all of these three things are part of our democracy, because democracy isn't just about voting in a general election every few years. Democracy is fundamental what happens between elections as well. Protest is part of democracy. Strike action is part of democracy. And yes, of course, voting in elections is part of democracy as well. All of these things, obviously, historically, weren't gifted to us by those at the top. All of these rights and freedoms had to be wrestled from the establishment by progressive working class movements. And that's what the Conservatives are trying to undermine now. They don't want people to be able to fight back against their unpopular policies and their dangerous agenda.
I think, really interesting points there. Really, I think it's worth emphasising as well. So look, I mean, they'll never out and out say, They'll never ban protest. They'll never say we're banning protest. They'll never say we're banning strikes, but they'll make it increasingly difficult. And I think so. We had, for example, we had some comrades on from Labour Black Socialists a couple of weeks ago, and they were talking about one of the key concerns here is you are putting political decisions in the hands of the police, and I mean, that lets the government off the hook. They can say, oh, well, we were quite happy for you to have a protest, but, the police made the decision and that's in the legislation. I mean, that's really dangerous, isn't it? I mean, what's your view on that?
Well, I think there's a lot of truth in that. And we've seen the police behave differently in different areas. I wasn't able to attend, but the reports I had back from the Kill the Bill protest in Leeds was that the police facilitated that. They didn't obstruct that protest. But then we see the appalling scenes from Bristol of police brutality. We saw as well the appalling scenes of the way police were treating women at the Sarah Everard vigil. So there is different approaches by the police on different occasions in different parts of the country. And we all know what happens when Tory governments start to try to use the police for their own political ends. We saw that, for example, in the miners' strike, didn't we? Where police from the London Met were drafted up to the coalfields and used in that very politicised way.
And yeah, again, so we had comrades from the Orgreave campaign on a few weeks back, and they drew a straight line from what happened in Orgreave and the scenes we saw last summer with a baton charge against Black Lives Matter demonstrators. How worried should we be about an increase in police powers?
We should be very worried about an increase in police powers. I mean, some of the measures in this bill, actually the police aren't calling for themselves either. For example, the measures in this bill, which are really discriminatory against the traveller community, those extra powers of criminalisation, the police have actually said they don't want those extra powers in relation to travellers. So you've got to ask yourself this question: if you're giving extra powers to the police that in that instance the police don't want, then what's going on here? It's clearly a political agenda from the government, as I say, trying to stop people having the power to fight back. In relation to the issue of discrimination against travellers, it seems to me it's part and parcel of what some people have called the government's culture wars, where they're trying to really consolidate the support of the right wing in the country behind them. So a kind of coalition between people who've always voted Conservative, people who have voted for far-right parties or haven't voted in the past but espouse far-right politics, bringing that together as a permanent coalition. And I think that's what some of the awful anti-traveller discrimination in this bill is about as well. It's playing politics in the crudest and most ugly and discriminatory of senses. So
would you say it's in a sense a kind of culture war dog whistle?
Of course, and it's not the only time that the Conservatives have done it. I mean, the Conservatives have got it on local election leaflets about Labour MPs voting against this bill, and they're saying that this shows that we're soft on travellers or soft on illegal activities. And those very ideas are awful, aren't they? The idea of being soft on travellers, not looking at the root cause of the situation, which is that actually local authorities need to be properly funded so that there are sufficient sites for travellers, decent sites available for them to use, because the real problem is the lack of facilities for travellers. And you don't solve that problem by criminalising the people who don't have enough facilities.
So from what you said, it seems like, so this is a real cynical attempt by the Tories to use legislation to really kind of drive a wedge in our society, to exacerbate existing anxieties around marginalised groups, to radically extend the powers that police have in many instances, powers that they don't want, and to almost like it's almost as though they're preempting a huge amount of public outcry as a result of the policies that they're implementing in the future, and so they're beefing up the potential that the state has to push back against ordinary people who are just standing up for themselves. So look, this legislation, it's at committee stage now. So after that, it will go to report, and then there's a third reading, I understand. So it's still making its way through the House of Commons, and obviously it'll go to the House of Lords. How can people watching this programme, how can they engage with politicians to lobby against it, and how can they engage outside of government?
Well, I think there needs to be a struggle against this bill in Parliament and outside Parliament as well. I think the protests against this bill have been incredibly important, because it's standing up for the right to peacefully protest. It's standing up for our hard-won democratic rights. We can't just leave this to MPs, especially when the Conservatives have an 80-seat majority. So there needs to be a campaign outside Parliament, and there needs to be activity inside Parliament as well. I'm glad that the Labour leadership is opposing this bill. And so much of the activity in terms of lobbying MPs has to be concentrated, I think, on those MPs who aren't currently opposing the bill, and that means Conservative MPs. And I think that an appeal can be made to some Conservative MPs on the basis of civil liberties. We need to break up the Conservative consensus on this bill. But I say we shouldn't leave it to MPs in Parliament. You know, we need protests across the country. We need people to be talking about this on social media. We need people to be holding discussions about this and holding meetings, whether it's Zoom meetings or whether it's social distance discussions in the local park, for example, as happened in Leeds at the weekend. All of these things are important, because when I said earlier about what is democracy, democracy isn't just voting in general elections. Democracy isn't just MPs in Parliament either. By taking part in peaceful protests, by taking part in discussions, by lobbying, all of these things are democracy as well. And all of these things are grassroots democracy, which is the most important democracy of all, really.
So the Tories have well, they say they've paused the progress of this legislation for the time being. Obviously, there has been a very strong public outcry. Do you think that means that what's the motivation behind them pausing that legislation? Do you think the protests are working?
Well, I think the protests are important, and I think the protests need to carry on and should be supported. But I don't think people should think that we can rest on our laurels and assume that the Conservatives are going to drop this bill or drop the most unpalatable and most egregious elements of this bill. You know, the Conservatives are a ruthless political entity. They're operating for a class interest. And as I say, what I think this is about is actually about two things. One, removing people's right to fight back, removing people's right to resist effectively when unpopular policies against the interests of the majority and against the interests of discriminating against minorities are on the way. But also, it's about trying to divide the country. And so the Conservatives probably think that there's some electoral advantage to them in pursuing what the right-wing papers may portray as the bogeymen of our age, whether that be environmental protesters, Black Lives Matter protesters, trade unionists or travellers. And I think the Conservatives think there's some political capital for them to gain out of that divide, for them to gain out of making the targets, the people I've mentioned, marginalised groups and progressive campaigns and trade unionists. So given that, I don't think we should underestimate the Conservatives' determination to push this through. Really glad
you mentioned the class consciousness of the Tories there, because it does not get talked about enough, just how class aware they are and how class focused everything they do is as a project. One of the things that's been remarked upon quite often actually is the real breadth of the coalition in opposition to this. I mean, it really does. It represents the working class in all its diversity. Do you think there's an opportunity here to build a kind of a class conscious resistance to this in a way that we've not really seen since, for example, I don't know, the poll tax?
Well, class consciousness has never gone away on the part of the people that run society. And if the Labour Party had been as class conscious through its history as the Conservative Party has been, then certainly I think we'd have been in power a lot more, and certainly would have been far more ruthless and far more effective electorally in every other way throughout our history. I mean, the Conservatives never let down the class that fundamentally they were founded and exist to represent the ruling class. In terms of the working class in all its diversity, it's an important point you make. By the working class, I mean the 99%. I mean the vast majority in our society, because I do think in a way that in much of the mainstream media, the term working class has ended up being used almost in the way that Margaret Thatcher used it, and almost in a way that many people use it in the United States, which is basically the poorest 20% in society, the working class, and everyone else virtually is so-called middle class. When I say working class, I mean the vast majority in our society, and I mean the working class in all its diversity. And you're right, these protests and this movement, whether it's on the ground or online, is characterised by its diversity. And I think some food for thought for all progressives, including those in the Labour Party, is in the 2017 general election, Labour started to assemble an electoral coalition behind it, which really was the working class in all its diversity, young people, black and minority ethnic communities, people in unstable employment and 0 hours contracts. And we were really starting to put together a coalition which looked like and was and is the working class here and now in our country. And that's what we need to do again as a party. That's what we need to do again as a movement. I always think we've got to be as class conscious as the Tories, but to do so, we need to understand what the working class is and what the working class isn't. The working class, in my view, as I say, is the majority in society, and the working class is diverse. To state the obvious, and it shouldn't need stating, working class people live in cities as well as in towns. Working class people are young as well as old. Working class people work in call centres and offices as well as factories. Working class people may have been born in this country or in another country. The working class people of all colours. I make these points just because I think it's worth asserting, because class isn't cultural in my view. Class is economic, and on that basis, the vast majority in society are working class.
Really, really important points. And listen, thank you, Richard, for making the time to speak to us. I know you're really, really busy at the moment. Do you have any final thoughts for the people watching tonight?
Well, I'd just like to congratulate Socialist Telly on the programmes it held. And it's been a real lifeline for people on the left across the country to be able to tune into your programmes on a regular basis. And I'm really looking forward to things happening in person when things are more back to normal and it's safe to do so. For example, I think it'd be great to have Socialist Telly live broadcasts with live audiences there asking questions in person. You might need to do some fundraising, I don't know, to get to hire a studio that's bigger. But I think all of these things are important. And I think my message to people is that as a left, we can't allow ourselves to be ghettoised. We can't allow ourselves, even after that devastating election defeat in 2019, even though the opinion polls are so bad for Labour at the moment. We can't allow ourselves to start to view ourselves as being irrelevant. The left shouldn't underestimate its potential strength. The left shouldn't underestimate its potential influence and the power of our ideas, because as sure as night follows day, those that run society, including in the right-wing media and in the Tory party and other right-wingers, they don't underestimate the potential of the left, and that's why they're attacking us and criticising us all the time. You look at the manifesto policies from 2017 and 2019, we can build upon those. Those policies are more relevant than ever before, given the challenges that we face. And as we are in this huge, devastating, terrible public health crisis, as we're in this historic economic crisis, then actually the radical transformative policies of the left are more relevant now than ever before. Managerialism and thinking around the edges doesn't provide the solutions to the problems that the working class knowledge diversity in our country or around the world is facing. And so I think the left needs to be confident. Before the last general election, as a left, we were seeking to become the government, and we need to reflect upon that. We need to remain confident. We need to know that left ideas, socialist principles, anti-racist principles, the idea that there's something more important than the pursuit of profit. These things are more important and more relevant than ever, because the free marketeers, the get-rich-quick merchants, those who think profit's the most important thing, their model has failed, it's failed, and it's failed again. It's failed in the pandemic, it's failed in relation to the environment, it's even failed in relation to football. So we should have confidence. And I look forward to working with people watching Socialist Telly on defeating this bill, building a movement to defeat this bill, but also building a movement to create the better society.
Well, there you go. Really powerful call to action there from Richard Burgon. Richard, thank you so much for your time this evening.
My pleasure.
So really delighted that that Richard managed to make the time to speak to us. There is so much wrong with this bill, just from a legal point of view, from a justification point of view. What are your thoughts, Jane? Initial thoughts on seeing that interview?
Well, I thought there was a lot in what Richard said, wasn't there? But the key point for me was I'm very involved in Leeds on organising with many other groups around stopping this bill. And a lot of the people who we're organising with are very young and very new to protesting and don't want to give up their right to protest before they've hardly started. And so they're not quite sure how to engage. And so I thought his tips on how to engage in that process in targeting Tory MPs, because they're the ones who hold the balance of power on this. Labour are already on side on this. I think that's really important. So that's where we need to be pushing our political fire. But also, of course, Richard was pretty clear that actually protesting is going to be really, really important.
Yeah, it's about having that grassroots mobilisation, while at the same time that other engagement with the political process is going on. I mean, I think something that's really that sticks out for me in this legislation is all this talk around noise and disruption. There's some real hypocrisy there, because I can't see them using this as a way to prosecute illegal hunts, for example, which a bunch of people on horseback with trumpets charging across the countryside. I mean, this is really aimed at civil disobedience, isn't it? It's aimed at people who are fighting for their rights.
It is, and it's also stuff you can't really measure, isn't it?
Yeah.
It gives the police enormous, what's the word? License to just clamp down on anything that they fancy, or more likely, anything they're told to clamp down on will be stopped. And that'll be all of the things that we've seen that have been really important, like the Black Lives Matter protest, which clearly got right up the Tories' nose, didn't it? So many Tories have been saying, how they didn't really agree with Black Lives Matter. And so that's clearly one of the things. And that's really important because we've seen the effect this week that those Black Lives Matter protests have had in terms of pushing the American legal system to a place that it never wanted to be. And to be honest, who would have imagined? I could see George Floyd's killer getting sent to prison, but not on a unanimous verdict. That's absolutely incredible. That's the power of protest that's really pushed their judicial system. And they know that can happen here, and it needs to happen here because we also have, racism rampant and endemic in our country, in our society. So there's, really important stuff there, isn't there?
And I think there's a really important point there as well about, so when you look at the civil rights movement, when you look at the suffragettes in this country, the trade union movement, all sorts of progressive forces, always at the time, they are resisted by the powers that be, they are criminalised, they are told that they are disruptive and all the rest of it. And then later on, when they've won the argument, they suddenly there's a little bit of a rearranging of history and suddenly, they did it all by the book and all the rest of it. Nonsense. No one's ever got change by going by the book. And this book is incredibly restrictive in terms of what it'll let people do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And people might think, well, actually, I never really get involved in protest. And it just wouldn't really affect me. Now, actually, all the groups that have been involved, environmentalists, and my God, the environment, if you don't think that's going to affect you in the next 20 years, you need to think again. But Black Lives Matter protesters, animal rights activists, of course, trade unionists, and left-wing people. We've had all of them involved. But actually, we've had massive protests this week in football stadiums. Football fans have been protesting. And that's something that under this bill wouldn't be allowed. And look how incredibly effective that protest's been. This Super League thing, well, in Britain, it's collapsed in a week, hasn't it? So protest really works. The establishment know that. The Tories know that. That's why they're doing this.
I think that's a really important point. And I think there was something Richard said as well that really it underlines how much power we actually have, right? Where they can't come out and say that they'll ban the right to strike. They can't come out and say they'll ban the right to protest. So they have to basically ban all the things that go into that and make it incredibly difficult, but they can't come out and say what they actually want to do. And that's why we've got to resist this stuff.
Absolutely. Everything the Tories do. I mean, the fact that they've got our students wrapped up in tens of thousands of pounds worth of debt, so that hopefully that'll keep them under the cosh and they'll need to work all their lives to pay that debt off and be in fear from that debt. The fact that they've got so many people who are working for the minimum wage, which isn't enough to pay all their bills and to keep the roof above their head and to keep them fed. And so those people are terribly oppressed by poverty and by poor pay, by everyone who's disabled and on benefits, who's unemployed and on benefits, hasn't got enough money to actually live on. No one can live on the poverty level of benefit that's paid in this country. So poverty is grinding those people down. All of these things, it's all designed to keep your head down so that you won't be spending your time fighting back and arguing back and just stopping people's right to protest, just like frustrating the ability to strike, is all about making us more and more subservient, more and more like wage slaves, and less like independent people who can stand proudly and fight back when things are going bad.
Absolutely, and I think it speaks volumes about the confidence this government has in how popular the outcomes some of its policies are going to be in the coming years. That it has to put this draconian legislation on the books. Just before we wrap up, I did want to talk about. We talked about it with Richard, but I know you were at the protest in Leeds, and you talked about how diverse the movement in opposition to this is. I wonder if you talk us through that a little bit.
It was incredibly diverse. As I say, we had environmentalists there, and we've got an airport expansion on the horizon in Leeds, and so there's a lot of people in opposition to that. Black Lives Matter is very big in Leeds. They were there in big numbers. We had all sorts of trade unions. Of course, I'm the president of the Trades Council, so all the trade unions were there, which was fantastic. Although we must get the unions more involved. Because that will be another huge block on this bill. We had trans activists there too, but we also had just rafts and rafts of young people, because they are the most political generation that we have seen. I was brought up under Thatcher, and even under Thatcher, young people were not as predominantly left-wing as they are today. They absolutely, as a bloc, are very, very, very left-wing, and they got the worst, most right-wing government. So they've got an awful lot to protest about and awful lot to fight back about. And that was why they were there, and it was great to see them. So we need to help, and that's partly what we're doing today, help to direct them in the right way politically to oppose this bill. The one thing I would like to say as well, to finish on really, Richard's point, we are Don't Leave organised. We make these protests, these broadcasts to educate people about being in the Labour Party and staying in the Labour Party to fight back. And, Richard really makes you realise how important that is, because we need a lot more Richard Burgons in Parliament. He really speaks for me in Parliament. I know he speaks for a lot of people. We need more of that. But also Labour are doing the right thing on this bill. They absolutely are. They're opposing it. So we need to make sure that we're playing our part by keeping in the Labour Party, getting more Richard Burgons elected. And as I say, as it says on the tin, don't leave organised. That's what we need to do, isn't it?
Absolutely, couldn't have said it better myself. And we do lean very heavily on Tony Benn in this programme. We mention him often, but I think it really springs to mind you talking about the diversity of that crowd at the rally in Leeds, which I'm sure is replicated up and down the country. It's that, every generation has to fight the same battle, doesn't it? And that's what we're trying to do here. We want you to go into that battle forewarned and forearmed about battles that have happened in the past and educate you about the current battles that are going on. And really, we need to be big coalitions to do that. And one of the biggest coalitions is inside the Labour Party. So stay and fight. Support Kill the Bill protests where you see them. Support MPs like Richard Burgon who are fighting for you. And most importantly, do not go gentle into that good night. Watch Educate, Agitate, Organise every Saturday night. Jane, pleasure as always.
Brilliant. Thanks, Matt.